Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar on managing energy sector bias and ageism. And the focus is on preparing you for communications with employers. We have people that are still being admitted, but I think I'll just continue to keep us on track with time. So the work that Pat and I have been leading under this project has been funded by the government of Alberta. So we're really, really pleased for that support. And we are located in the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi and the People of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. And I think what I'll do is I'll just move to the objectives so that people joining can see them. Pat and I have been doing this work for, oh my goodness, over 25 years in the energy sector as well as other sectors. And there really is a difference now. In the past, we've done labor adjustment work where there's been a plant closure that has affected a town, or labor adjustments that have affected an industry. But in the last few years, and really since 2014, it's really been the whole economy that's affected. And so we know that the transition from oil and gas or within oil and gas is very much a more significant challenge than it was previously. The good news is we appear to be heading into recovery, but this is evolving. So it's really important to know what to monitor, and that's really what we're covering today. So I'll go through the objectives and at the same time introduce the team who are nicely clad in green. Andrea, if you could go back on camera, because I'm going to introduce you too, and I want to see your green. Oh yeah, very good. Okay, so our objectives. Pat and I do a lot of work where we consult with employers, and we'd like to share with you what we hear from them with respect to hiring from the oil and gas talent pool, and then give you some insights into how different employers will value and approach experienced oil and gas workers. Then we'll go into how to develop your transition story using some tools and resources. And one of them is a framework that we've developed for how to assess your best path to employment through understanding your transferable skills. And then we'll use all that to give you some strategies for overcoming employer bias and ageism, and provide you some tips and resources to monitor employment opportunities. Then we'll shift into what has been an emerging need or more prevalent need over the last couple of years, and that is the whole area of mental health and wellness and resiliency for people that are faced with employment disruption. And we have Avery Morris, who's going to be leading us through that. And then when we're completed that section, Pat will lead us through the Q&A, and she will also monitor chat. And Andrea Newell, who rounds out the team, is our technical support, and we'll launch a couple of polls that we have. So with that, you're stuck with me for the next little while. And firstly, I'll just go into the webinar protocols. And I feel like I don't even need to say much about this, but I'll quickly cover them for you. You probably saw that the meeting is being recorded, and that's so we can share the recording with you. And we will also share the slides. We have two polls in this webinar. They give us an opportunity to collect up-to-date information from you, but also for you to hear what others are experiencing. And we ask you to stay on mute and to use chat to ask your questions or share reactions. And if you want to direct message any of the hosts, you can do so by selecting the appropriate person in the chat and provide a confidential question if you choose to do so. Okay, so we have 20 people here, and I think that's a great number for us to start our first poll. So in fact, we did this poll in September of 2021, so not quite a year ago, but I think it'll be really interesting to see if anything's changed since then with respect to the barriers you're experiencing finding employment. So if you can go ahead and choose the barriers that are most have impacted you the most. There's several to choose from. Maybe go with your top 3 or 4. And if a barrier you're experiencing isn't on the list, then just go ahead and put your additional comment in chat. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to do that. And just a few more seconds for the remainder of you to respond. Okay, let's close that poll, Andrea. So having a look at the results, and at the same time, I'll give you a little bit of insight as to what's changed from 8 months ago. So lack of employment opportunities is a barrier. And in fact, that was significant last time, but it's gone down from 46 to 40%. Unsure how to transition my skills and experience. Interesting, this has gone up from last time. And what is also good is we're going to cover this in significant depth in this webinar. Overqualified for available job opportunities has almost doubled from before, as well as ageism has increased significantly as a perceived barrier. Bias against oil and gas workers has gone down. Unsure of what training to take has gone down, which is excellent. Uncertain how to promote my value and fit to employers. That's a new question. So I don't have a stat from 8 months ago, but we do share quite a bit on how to promote your value and fit to employers in this webinar. And then, as you can see, the lowest ones are lack of confidence, available jobs that do not meet salary expectations, and difficult being motivated. So keep in mind how you answered this poll, because many of the points that are in here we're going to address in this workshop. So let's start out with the intelligence that Pat and I have gathered from employers. As I've mentioned, we do a lot of work within the broader energy ecosystem. We just finished a really large project with CRIN, which is the Clean Resource Innovation Network, and consulted with clean tech employers. This particular information on this slide was collected through a survey that was conducted at the end of 2020 of 105 HR professionals. And here's what they told us about hiring from the oil and gas talent pool. And what they told us is a barrier or a challenge for you, but it's also an opportunity. And I'd like you to keep these in mind as we go through the webinar. So employers said that they are unsure how to assess your transferability into oil and gas. I find that really interesting, and it gives you an opportunity to show them and tell them how you are transferable to their sector. They're concerned about whether or not you'll fit in with their culture and their work environment. They're concerned that your compensation expectations will not fit, and that you will leave this alternate sector once you've identified a job in the oil and gas industry. So these are your challenges and opportunities. And as you can see from the final comment, that many sectors are already hiring from the oil and gas workforce. We have also heard from employers that they're taking different approaches to hiring depending on the type of employer they are, or the size of the company. And this in some way may be counterintuitive, but we think it provides you insights to focus and direct your job search. So large companies, if you can just remember build and buy, they have the capacity and the sophistication to build and buy talent. So in fact, many large companies are currently focusing on internal upskilling and redeployment so that their own staff are part of the transition that they're making to a lower carbon economy. They could also buy talent from sectors with the fit for purpose skills that they need, and so they'll go across Canada or internationally to hire the specific expertise they're looking for. They're also investing in developing a talent pipeline through internships, co-ops, and new grad hiring. This is ramped up. They use a broad array of attraction approaches using social media, but also use traditional job boards, their own job postings. And of course, they're much more structured. Human resources may be more directly and formally involved in the hiring process, which might mean that your contacts may not get you into the door. Whereas in smaller companies, you'll have more opportunity with relationships and contacts. So small companies in maturing sectors value experienced workers based on their need to improve their profit margins and your ability to address operational efficiency. So again, these are opportunities. They use social media to hire, as well as traditional hiring processes, leveraging relationships. Small companies in emerging sectors can be the hardest to find, but the greatest opportunities for you to network and build relationships, because they hire through introductions and networking. They need talent that can hit the ground running, that has depth, has a breadth of experience. And it could be the best opportunity for mature workers, as long as you can demonstrate that you've got the agility to work in a more flexible work environment than is typical of oil and gas. Other things we're hearing from employers are things that are driving employment and some of the grief that it's causing them. And the grief that employers are speaking about now is that talent is increasingly cited as a key challenge. We're hearing that more and more. And, again, that's obviously an opportunity. Alberta's growth in particular is driven by decarbonization goals, regulations, and investments. This is also being driven by national regulations and strategies. And I'll be bringing those up quite frequently as strategies and regulations are kind of a key way to get an understanding of future hiring requirements. So decarbonization goals and regs are having an especially significant impact to oil and gas, which has seen increased hiring, renewables, and the clean tech sectors. These tend to be the sectors that we focus on the most, and that are adjacent to oil and gas and where you're going to have the greatest opportunities. And the skill and occupational requirements in these sectors is more increasingly driven and influenced by ESG commitments, environmental, social, and governance commitments. And sometimes the E also refers to economic more and more. Collaboration, which requires a whole myriad of skill sets, which we'll tell you about, and how innovation is playing a role in technology development, but but bringing technology to commercial use. We are seeing both from employers and research reports that there is growing evidence that employers are identifying skills that where they are experiencing deficits. And again, learning about these skills will create opportunities for you. And finally, emerging sectors such as renewables have a much more limited talent pool to draw from. And what is interesting, because emerging sectors in the adjacent or broader energy ecosystem have a focus on decarbonization goals, decarbonization in fossil fuels is already found in the oil and gas industry and presents an opportunity to transition into these other sectors. So now what I'd like to do is give you a little bit more insight into how the activities in oil and gas, especially those that are focused on decarbonizing fossil fuels, can create opportunities for you in these adjacent energy sectors. So on the left are priority activities for the oil and gas industry. I expect that you've signed up for this webinar because you are an experienced energy industry worker. And that tells me that you are very likely to have been involved in some of these priority activities and have some of the skills required to deliver on them. So the activities are cost competitiveness and profitability, ESG, and through to expanded supply chains that are impacting oil and gas, especially in the downstream where you see biotech, biofuels being more involved in the refining business. So how are these activities relevant to other sectors? We'll get into in more detail in a few minutes, but the sectors where these activities are relevant and therefore your skills are highlighted on the right. And these are the sectors where we are primarily focused on and where we would urge you to focus your job search. And, I kind of feel many of you know this already, but again, this is a good table to remind you where to look when you're looking for employment. So let's turn to looking more personally at you and your transition story. So it is important to be able to tell a genuine and impactful story to employers about why you are transitioning, what you're doing to transitioning, and why this employer or this particular sector is a part of your transition story and goals. So really, your transition story is made up of assessment and sharing. And this is your responsibility, not a recruiter's or employers to pull this out of you, but it is your responsibility to assess your value and to share your value. And the first way to assess your value is to get an understanding of an employer's or a sector's needs and interests, and really try to find out what those skills in deficit are, because it is more likely that you have those technical skills, and not simply the technical skills, but also the soft skills that will make you more adaptable to different work environments. And the ways in which you understand what employers' needs or are interested in is through your understanding of the industry, your research into the industry, and your research into the market. And those are the things that we're going to get into with respect to that. Your value is made up of the advantages that you bring through the table. And you have advantages of an accumulation of knowledge because of your experience. And it's really hard as an experienced person to often recognize the strength of that accumulated knowledge and how it is transferable to other sectors. And you don't create or develop that accumulated knowledge by going to university and simply being a graduate. It comes with years and years of experience. So that brings direct value to employers, but it also brings value to employers in that you share that knowledge with the younger workforce. So more and more today, employers are seeing the richness and the value of intergenerational skills to support young people to garner the skills that more mature workers have. So we're going to help you to assess and understand how to share your value in a couple of different ways. The first is through a resource that Pat and I created called Starting With You. So this is perhaps the hardest work because starting with you involves your reflection and your assessment on what you have, what you want, and what are you willing to do to get there. And by doing this work, using the Starting With You workbook that you can download at careertransitions.ca, or open it up in the follow-up email that we'll send you. By doing this work, you'll have better evidence of the transferability of your individual skills and experience into other sectors and the gaps to help you to understand what upskilling might be needed to get you what you want. So we'll get more into how Starting With You works in a couple of minutes, but I'd like to go into the second way that that we are providing you with information to prepare your transition story. And that's through a framework. And again, Pat and I have been working on this framework. I shouldn't say working on it because it's not really a work in progress. It's being developed over the past 3+ years and has been tested in use to help you to assess sector to sector transition and occupation to occupation transition. In this webinar, we focus on sector transferability and less so on occupation to occupation transition. But by signing up with this webinar, you will be subscribed to our newsletter, and you can sign up for other webinars that will get you more up to speed on occupational transition. And you can also go to careertransitions.ca where you will find this information. So transferability from sector to sector. So remember, our focus is on transferability from oil and gas to other sectors, and we're focusing on adjacent sectors in the broader energy ecosystem. You can use this methodology for transferability from any sector to another. So the first thing that one needs to do in answering the question, how transferable is my oil and gas experience to renewables, to clean tech, to heavy industrial construction, is to look at transferability in 3 different ways. Firstly, technical transferability, then nature of work transferability, and lastly, value proposition transferability. We're going to be peeling those out, but I'll define them for you quickly here. And in careertransitions.ca, we have rated the transferability on each of these criteria for about 7 sectors as being high, medium, and low. And we've also done that from at an occupational level. So technical transferability assesses how similar the two sectors' requirements for core qualifications, certifications, use of equipment, business processes, and so on are to the oil and gas industry. So if it's similar, we've rated it high, and as you expect, not similar, low, and so on. So while technical transferability is the most obvious and probably traditional way of assessing transferability, we also look at transferability in two other ways. Nature of work, which looks at how similar are the work arrangements in the from sector, oil and gas in this case, to the to sector in terms of work arrangements, workplace culture, relationships in the environment. And thirdly, the value proposition. How likely is it that you'll actually accept an offer? And we all know that we are concerned about a competitive offer, but a competitive offer is about much more than the salary meeting your needs. It's also about career and training opportunities, where the work is located, and more an alignment of the values that you hold with the values of the sector or the company. So through these three criteria of evaluating sector to sector transferability, you'll be able to assess your fit and your stick to that two sectors. How well will you fit and how long will you stick? And more importantly, that's your transition story. That is your evidence to the employer that you've really thought through this transition and that you'll stay. And it is up to you to make that in a genuine sort of way. So digging deeper into each of them, we'll start with technical transferability. I'll show you how it looks and how it looks when you look at it through either careertransitions.ca or using the Starting With You workbook. So technical transferability takes a look at these core elements of technical transferability and asks you to think about and assess how you use your skills and knowledge in the most adept and high performance way. We're all different. Some of us are really, really good at using our skills for the purpose of data analysis, processing information, deriving learnings from information, and so on. Whereas others are more adept at using their skills to work with individuals or groups of people. And others are especially good at taking their knowledge and troubleshooting with machinery or equipment or or buildings and applying their skills to either, fixing or building things. So think about that, because these skills will be of value to employers in different ways, depending on their focus and the business that they're in. Any gaps that you identify when you're using Starting With You in your technical transferability helps you to answer the question, what am I willing to do? What upskilling are you willing to do to be transferable? So moving from what do I have? Oh, no, we're not moving from what do I have. This is an example of, let me just go back, an example of technical transferability and the domain knowledge that you have acquired in oil and gas and how that domain knowledge is of value in these adjacent sectors. So the experience that you have in equipment, technology, and expertise in the oil and gas industry can be leveraged into these adjacent sectors. So I've got two slides here that I'm just going to show you because we're going to share these with you after, but it shows you that skills that you may have in oil and gas, not all of them, but several of them, are in demand and are skills that may be in deficit in these adjacent sectors. So for example, emission measurement, reduction, and reporting is a common skill required in oil and gas and will continue to be, but it's also needed in geothermal, all of the clean tech subsectors, and you can see how we've broken them down here, as well as petrochemicals and LNG operations. Now, in this webinar, we're not going into these sectors in great depth, but you can find out more about how we came up with these transferability assessments in careertransitions.ca or by attending an upcoming webinar. And just the second slide, which again shows you on the left, other examples of oil and gas expertise and how they are valued in adjacent sectors. So moving from what do I have into what do I want? And this, again, starting with you and self-reflection will help you to develop your transition story and to be realistic about what transferability opportunities will work best for you and your family. So nature of work transferability is about different work arrangements. You may or may not be able to be a rotational worker or to travel. But you need to know whether or not you can. It's also about the type of work environment where you work the best. Some people cannot stand to work indoors at a desk, whereas others don't want to be working in the elements. And then lastly, what kind of work culture are you accustomed to, and what kind of work culture can you adapt to? So starting with you on the right, we'll ask you to think about the type of place that you would like to work. It will urge you to think about that and then ask you what are the deal breakers, because those deal breakers will mean that you should not be applying for certain jobs, for example, that require you to travel if you cannot do so. So very hard to cover those things up. So assess and share. What do you want? And if there are gaps, evaluate whether you can address those gaps through upskilling. Pat and I have just recently completed a project with CRIN, and again, I'll define the acronym for a second time. That's the Clean Resource Innovation Network. Through that project, we developed a labor market outlook for clean tech, as well as career information products for clean technologies. It provides you with a myriad of information about the skills and occupations required for clean tech innovation, as well as clean technology specifically. But really interesting to us was over and over again, when we spoke to employers, they kept on bringing us back to these universal skills, these universal attributes, which are much more difficult to train for than our technical requirements. So in order to future-proof yourself, think about the extent to which you have these universal skills, because they are needed in an environment where innovation involves the development and deployment of technology, which means the nature of work is becoming more collaborative and changing, and that rests more significantly on universal skills, soft skills, and behaviors. And guess what? These are developed over time with the accumulated experience that you have garnered by working in different work arrangements, by working in different environments and with different types of people. So use this as a bit of a checklist to evaluate the extent to which you have demonstrated in the past that you are agile, that you can build relationships, and bearing in mind that some of these things will be different than you saw demonstrated in oil and gas. So for example, in oil and gas, we are less likely to involve the breadth of partnerships and sectors that we see being involved in the innovation and development and commercialization of clean tech or digital technologies. It's much more collaborative. It involves a variety of sectors working together all at once. So this is, to me, very useful information that came directly from employers that you can use as a tool to evaluate and to tell your transition story. So now we're going to shift into the last aspect of what do I want, and that's the value proposition transferability. So value proposition is about the employment offer, and the offer in a comprehensive way. It does include salary, bonus, benefits, you know, all of those things that you would think, but it also is the location of work, which creates value for you because you don't have to commute or leave your family, or you're able to get to soccer games. It also includes the role level, and that may be more important to you than is salary. And it also includes the opportunity to continue to learn and to train and develop. And as well, more so, as I've mentioned before than in the past, an alignment of values that you hold with the values of a sector. So starting with you, we'll ask you to think about these values or these aspects of the value offer to be able to communicate to them, to employers, and to be convincing that it's not just about salary. It's about the value proposition that they offer on balance. And you can find out where an employer sits in terms of their value proposition, you know, through their websites and job postings. You also need to be prepared to think about deal breakers, because it may mean that you shouldn't apply, or you're going to get caught in an interview by being asked one of these deal breaker questions, and they'll move on to somebody else. So one of the deal breakers, of course, is if your wage expectations are too high for the sector. And again, we know oil and gas is the highest paying sector in Alberta. There are other sectors such as clean tech, which is aligned with oil and gas, which pays high wages, as does industrial construction. But the most important thing is not to seek out the sectors with high wages, is to understand the full value proposition and to do your research to know the wages that the sector pays so that you're not surprised. So these are resources for you, as are careertransitions.ca, which provides you information about transferability in those adjacent sectors. And careertransitions.ca, Pat and I are proud to tell you, has been used to develop a new website by Petro LMI called Careers in Energy. So that's that's content that we've developed and shared with them for this website. Okay, so we're going to sort of dive a little deeper, and I can see that there's lots of chat coming up. I'm not looking at it. Pat's monitoring it. Keep up the chat, keep up the questions, and we'll have a good amount of time at the end to answer your questions. So, telling and selling your transition story specifically in a way that helps employers to overcome biases that they may have towards oil and gas workers or mature workers. And, we'll just refer that to the ism, the ageism. So again, as we've been saying consistently up to now, you really need to have your transition story together. Your employers will be interested and intrigued with the richness of your story. It's not, I want to find a job, I'm unemployed, I need a job. It's a transition story that involves a job, but also involves that much more. So your transition story is about what you offer and the advantages that you can provide to the employer and the other employers within the company based on, again, your your experience, those skills that you bring. You also should include in the transition story an understanding of the employer's needs, those skills in deficit that they're going to be interested in, and to address your transferable skills, the similarity of skills between oil and gas and that sector, to address their biases. And you can do that through a myriad of ways. Networking with people is probably one of the best ways, but also do that in your cover letter, resume, and of course, be prepared to do that in interviews. And remember, we started out sharing with you top concerns that employers have about hiring from the oil and gas talent pool. So keep those in mind and address those in your transition story. So be prepared to answer the question and probably answer it in advance in a genuine and believable way. Why are you looking to change industries and will stay in that industry? I've had people say in previous webinars, because this is a safe place, well, quite frankly, I won't stay. If I get an offer to go back in oil and gas, I'll leave. Well, you've got two options. Don't apply to another sector, or find a way to make that believable, because you won't get hired with that answer. So take some time to think that through from the employer's perspective. Explain why you know you need and want to make a shift in industries, and why that's why that's of interest to you. Also, you should be prepared to explain how you fit with the employer's needs and interests, and not just your technical requirements fit, but how the nature of work and value proposition fits with you and will make you stick with them. So identify their skills in deficit in advance and demonstrate how you can fill some of those skills and deficits through your strengths and advantages. Use the terminology of the sector to ensure that they know you've done your research, and demonstrate ways that that you know how to use the terminology in that sector. Demonstrate ways that you've invested in your transition before you get to the interview, and actually have gained new skills and knowledge by showing them the results of your market research, by telling them what training you've done, what webinars you've attended, and how you've learned about that sector. So I guess what we're going to go into very, very shortly provides you with a good sense of how to do that market research and what to research. We also have heard from employers that market research, being aware and knowledgeable about the two company and the two sector, is a real differentiating factor. So I'll be going into that in another slide or two. So ageism. The approach to addressing ageism is very similar to addressing energy sector bias. We do know that it's a real thing. We've heard reports of it. Employers have expressed concerns about mid-career transitions, but the concerns that they've expressed are all addressable by identifying your nature of work transition and your value proposition transition, showing that you fit and that you will stick by understanding their skills in deficit. So again, focus on your advantages. You can only control what you can control. Focus on your advantages and your ability to adapt to a variety of work situations. If you haven't worked in anything but a large company, that networking, that doing those information interviews, reading job postings are a number of ways of understanding what might be different about the work environment. Tell them what you've acquired through your years of experience, and not just your technical skills, but also those universal future-proofing skills that you have accumulated over years of experience. Show them that you understand and want to bring value to less experienced workers. And again, like we've mentioned before, address this in all sorts of ways that you're interacting with potential employers. Relating back to the different approaches that different size of employers have to recruitment, we would urge you to target employers based on your research and based on those attributes that are most likely to benefit from your value. And lastly, this may seem obvious, but in looking at resumes, I know that it's not always obvious to people. Make sure that your resume is not making it too easy to screen you out due to age. You want to have the opportunity through a face-to-face interview or through reading your covering letter for an employer to see that value that you bring. So never should your resume list every job if your experience goes back to the 80s or 90s. I seldom indicate the year I graduated from university, but I may indicate the year that I completed more current upskilling. And never, either on a resume or an interview, volunteer your age. They ought not to ask. And the way I respond to an awkward question, how old are you? Or as a woman in the past, gee whiz, let me go back to the way past. How will you deal with your experience with children? With your children. That's not a question that should be asked. The way I deal with those questions is with another question by saying, interesting question. What is it that interests you about that question? Or why do you ask? So practice dealing with some of those awkward questions, because while employers ought not to ask them, we all know that some of them do anyway, and you can't control that. I would urge you to go to ALICE, which is, the Alberta government's resource that has some excellent resources specifically for mature workers. And we've provided you the link right there. Okay. This is really our wrap-up section before we go into a discussion of mental resiliency and our Q&A. So, as I've mentioned earlier, employers have indicated that they are somewhat surprised when employees come to them, or potential employees come to them without an understanding of their company or the sector. And it's generally easy to do some of the research, but can be difficult to do greater or more in-depth research. And that is what Pat and I do to monitor demand in the environment and what you can do to monitor employment opportunities. So we think of this as looking at the key drivers of employment. And we look at the leading indicators of employment as well as lagging indicators of employment. A leading indicator of employment gives you future insight and gives you more time to prepare. A lagging indicator of employment, such as job posting sites, is more reactive, and you're in a larger, you're within a larger group of competitors vying for the same jobs. So we would urge you to look at the leading indicators of employment listed here. First and foremost, changing regulations. Regulations lead to innovation and investment and jobs. They're kind of the tip of the iceberg, if you will. And I've highlighted some regulations that are changing as early as the end of March and this spring. And it's really important to look into those because they will impact those sectors in the broader energy ecosystem. Regulations also spur government programs and incentives for growth. So these are all connected, and they also lead to investments. Maybe less connected, but also a driver of demand are workforce demographics in the two sector. The older the workforce, the more employers may be hiring to replace workers that are exiting. So you can find this information on Stats Canada. Tracking these leading indicators will also give you insight as to the timing and quantity of demand. And again, this is what Pat and I do. So we think that your goals should be, in order to differentiate yourself, and there's 20 some of you here, so you have a chance to be different from the others that haven't attended this webinar by learning about the industry and the employment opportunities and qualifications using the sector's terminology and sources that I'll highlight in a couple of seconds. You've got the opportunity to come to the interview or networking opportunity with a very, very clear understanding of your value and how you fit their skills in deficit through your technical requirements and your fit and stick with the nature of work and the value proposition that you want and will accept. And then lastly, monitoring those leading indicators of demand that we've already listed. How the heck do you do this? As I said, Pat and I do this for a living. It takes time. We focus on many sectors, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you won't focus on as many because you'll want to focus your transition. So it'll take you a lot less time. Here's how we do it. Again, the leading indicators of demand are listed on the left, and I've already covered them. Spending announcements, regulations, strategies, incentive and recovery programs. Perhaps what I haven't mentioned are industry life cycles and value chain. You know from being in oil and gas that the life cycle in oil and gas that is related to development is different than operations. So making the link or an understanding of the types of skills that you have based on the life cycle involvement in oil and gas and understanding the life cycle in the two sectors is very useful. And guess what? You can look at that life cycle breakdown in careertransitions.ca. The ways in which you monitor the leading indicators are through a myriad of resources listed on the right. You won't need to look at all of them. Urge you to join CRIN. It's free to be a member and anybody can join. And many of these allow you to sign up for regular updates or newsletters. Before we move on to our next section, I'm just going to highlight regulations and strategies because I updated this just this morning, actually. This is a really big time for regulations in Canada. The emissions reduction plan is going to be released at the end of March. It's a federal plan. It is a plan to reduce emissions by 2030 by 40 to 45%. And again, it's going to be released by the end of March. And remember how I indicated that regulations lead to innovation, to incentive programs, to investment. As well, the oil and gas emissions cap is going to be finalized this spring. The clean fuel regulation, which will regulate the use and the GHG emissions of liquid fuels, will be released this spring. And as well, there are federal and provincial strategies and initiatives for CCUS and hydrogen. So I would think these are important resources for you. So I've gone through a lot of information in a very short period. It's probably been a little bit overwhelming for you and a little exhausting. We'll send you the slides. You can take time to look at the resources. But with respect to being overwhelmed by this webinar, or just the sheer fatigue of looking for a job and assessing career options, we'd like to talk about mental wellness and resiliency. And I'd like to turn you over to the capable hands of Avery Morris. Avery.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for all of that excellent information. As mentioned, my name's Avery, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to manage your mental wellness and resiliency in the face of employer bias or a career transition. A little bit about me. I'm a registered provisional psychologist at Calgary Career Counseling and our partner practice, Synthesis Psychology. At Calgary Career Counseling, we focus on helping people make strategic and fulfilling career decisions, but the emphasis is really on incorporating and attending to mental and emotional well-being during the process, because we know it is not easy. It can bring up a lot of emotions, so we want to make sure you're equipped to handle all of that. So moving on to our first slide here, I just want to give you a brief what and why. Going through a career change or transition can be an emotional experience. I saw in the chat, people are talking about some of frustrations. So, we absolutely want to recognize those. And I think, having to confront or navigate employer bias can really add additional layers of stress and uncertainty. So, the goal is to make sure you're taking care of yourself. And the ways that we do take care of ourselves is about displaying resiliency to support our overall well-being. But we also know that mentally well people really engage in this process in a sustainable way. They're going to be able to meet their goals, and they're better able to navigate the biases that come up when they do. So to start things off, I want to ask everyone a question. We're going to do a poll, and this is a really quick way for us to check in and assess how we're currently managing. So when I ask, how are you doing personally? What I mean by that is, how are you feeling, coping mentally, emotionally, physically during this time? We can see there's a range of different options here, and I've provided some examples if you're not really sure how to categorize that at this time. So take a look at those. And I also really want to reinforce that it's okay however you respond. This isn't about, a right or wrong answer. It's about checking in, okay? So take some time, do a bit of an assessment, and then when everyone's answered, we'll sort of come back and review the results. We'll give a few more seconds here while some of the stragglers answer. Okay, so let's close the polling and have a look at what we came back with. So looking here, we can see that, it's fairly evenly distributed, but there's quite a few people that are feeling like they're just doing fair. So not feeling particularly great about their circumstances. And, I think that this is an important point to focus on, is that this can be really tough. It can be really emotionally draining. So what we want to do here is use this information and evaluate where we're at and implement strategies. So if we move on to our next slide, we're going to start with what's called a check-in checklist. And what this is about is recognizing that it's really easy for us to focus on the solutions and tangible things that we can do, particularly during times of high stress. And I'm a pragmatic person. I think practical elements are really important, but they're not sustainable if you're not attending to your mental health. So we see a lot of people felt like they were doing just okay, and that means that we need to have the ability to say, I'm not doing well, and what can I do to make this better or improve the way that I am feeling right now? Now, on this slide here, I have a checklist, and it's one I've actually pulled from the Mental Health Commission of Canada. It's a website, and I've included that link later on in the PowerPoint, so you will have access to that. But what this is it's an interactive checklist that you can go through and select different indicators to examine where you might be on what we call the mental health continuum. So basically, how are you feeling? How are you doing? And we can see there's lots of different ways that you can be impacted: mood, thinking patterns, even physical changes, your appearance. And I want to, again, stress this. You're probably tired of hearing it, but there is no right or wrong answer. This is just about how you are responding. And I also want to mention that if you're noticing some of those responses are more in the injured or ill, again, the very poor on that polling question, that doesn't mean that, you're beyond help or you're past the point of no return. This is still going to be useful for you. There's still strategies we can do. Sometimes when we're feeling that poorly, it can just be an indicator we might need some additional resources, or even we might need additional individualized support. Okay. And again, those resources are going to be provided. But the intent here is for us to be able to recognize if things have shifted and if they're getting progressively better or worse. So with that, I want to mention that this is a great starting point, particularly if this check-in process is a new thing for you. But another helpful tool is to develop your own checklist, one that's personalized, reflects, your experience when you are stressed, worried, and anxious. So as we see here, I've included some questions you can ask yourself. How am I feeling today? What emotions am I experiencing? Where can I feel it in my body? That's an important one, right? We know that stress and worry can show up physically. You can ask yourself, what did I do today that made me feel relaxed or excited? What's something I'm looking forward to? Answers to these questions don't necessarily give you automatic solutions, but they give us a snapshot into where we're at in terms of our mental health. And so, for example, chronic aches or pains, that's usually indicative of chronic stress. Sleepless nights, maybe you're spending all of your time worrying about things. Nothing to look forward to, a cue that we intentionally need to make time for something good in our lives. So what we want to do, just to recap, is create a list of questions. We want to track and monitor those responses so we can notice changes. And then we want to implement strategies that are in alignment with those indicators that you're not feeling well. And that leads us into what can we do, which is, I'm sure, why most of you are here. Now, monitoring those changes is especially important because that's how we can understand if our current behaviors are helping or hindering our wellness, and that is resiliency. So if some of you have been in webinars previously, or if you're new, a reminder, resiliency is about responding to challenges or how we react in the face of adversity, right? It's not always being positive. It's not never struggling. It is about our reaction. So creating a check-in checklist is important because it's difficult to respond in healthy and resilient ways. But if we don't know what we're responding to or what we should be focusing on, then it's not going to be particularly helpful. I also really want to mention that I recognize some of the strategies we're about to be talking about are things that could be new, which is great, or they could be things that you're doing. I'm not here to dismiss, any efforts that you've put in. Really, this is a way to remind you what you can do, or you're on the right path, or an opportunity to maybe tweak or reset your approach to wellness, okay? So the three things I'm going to focus on are practicing acceptance, building self-esteem, and using what we call balanced thinking. So to start, practice acceptance. We know, and we can talk about this repeatedly, how tough this time is. But I think that there is something else that we have to address when we believe employer bias is preventing us from, making the changes in our life. And having to deal with that can really make us feel stuck and prevent us from moving forward. So the first strategy we want to talk about is what I call grieve, but don't dwell. And this is a very important distinction to make in practicing acceptance. Grief after a loss, which I want to be clear, changing a job, having to engage in a career transition absolutely counts as a loss and is something you can grieve. That is a valid thing to be experienced, very normal. There can be change in identity, a loss in our time, energy, education, all of which can feel like a void in our life, right? We know how career is so important. It's such a large part of our lives. We spend so much time and energy there. So we have to acknowledge that, this is something that I may or may not be happy about. But if we spend too much time focusing only on the things that we are or will be without, that's when we start to move into dwelling. And it's really unhelpful and it's not particularly productive. So prevent this, we want to have some things in place that help us move forward. And that comes in the form of having a plan, a bit of a timeline about next steps, external supports, things that are going to keep us moving forward and give us momentum. I also want to stress that grief or loss itself does not have a timeline. So if you're still feeling upset about some of these changes or the biases that you're having to confront, that's okay, rightfully so. We just want to be mindful that it's not impeding healthy decisions in your life or disrupting healthy behaviors. That's when we might need some additional support to manage, okay? And this leads really nicely into the second strategy, which is look ahead. Again, when I said we're transitioning, we tend to look backwards. We focus on those past things exclusively. And when it comes to biases in particular, we often focus on things that we cannot change, right? We can't change our age, or we can't change the industry we've come from. So we might be thinking a lot about, well, if I'd only done this, or well, those were the good old days, sort of that mentality. Not particularly helpful, right? So we want to think about what's possible and what can I have going forward? What am I excited about? We want to recognize that we can't change the past, we can only learn from it. So we want to bring that knowledge and experience into the present and help us, or use it to help build a new future, okay? Another element of acceptance is understanding fight, flight, or freeze. And this is something I'm sure people are familiar with, in that people react in one of three ways, particularly during times of stress. And in the context of career change, we can look at it as fight is often when people are overworking to find a new job, like running themselves into the ground with it. Flight is seeking distraction, maybe spending all of their time on tinkering around the house, doing those fixer-uppers instead of actually doing the things that might help them see some progress, or they might be frozen where they are feeling so paralyzed and overwhelmed and quite hopeless. And what we want to do is notice your response and ask why that might be your reaction. Am I paralyzed because I struggle with decisions? Or am I paralyzed because I actually don't know what I'm excited about for the future? Am I in flight mode because it's hard for me to accept that my salary expectations might not be in alignment with what other industries will offer? Asking and answering these questions can allow you to recognize the root cause of your stress, can help you take control, adjust, and then work through that situation. So those are some three things that I would recommend if you're feeling really torn about where you're at right now. The next set of strategies I want to talk about is building self-esteem. And, not only is it tough emotionally, but I think our self-esteem, our ego can really take a hit during a job search, even if you're not confronting bias, right? It can be a time of what feels like rejection. So it impacts how we view ourselves and the outlook of our situation as well. So we want to continually and actively be reinforcing our self-esteem. And the first thing is really about a mindset. And it's the idea that worth doesn't equal externals. So a central part of building and maintaining self-esteem is recognizing what we call your core worth. And this is an unchanging part of you, and it is separate from external factors. So externals could be things like money, looks, relationship status, job titles, all things that really have been taught to us give us worth. And again, it's okay if you like those things, if you get enjoyment out of them. But when we equate our worth as a person or an individual to these external factors, our self-esteem rises and falls alongside them. So for example, when we receive a promotion, we feel amazing. We view ourselves as being someone of value. We lose a job, we don't get the next promotion, we see ourselves as worthless. And this puts us on such an emotional roller coaster, particularly because these external factors are often in flux during our lifetime, right? Things come and go, good things happen, bad things happen. So we want to distinguish between our feelings about events and behaviors from our feelings or perspectives about our core worth. And remember, you are worthwhile and worthy regardless of those things. The second strategy is one we call Strengths 360 at my job. And this is something we do with all clients. It's really about being able to recognize and assess your strengths. So what we have clients do is write out your own top 5 strengths, but then ask people around you to report back. It's helpful for people who know you in different contexts, especially because they can give you insight that maybe you wouldn't have thought of, right? There's things that you take for granted as a strength. Maybe they've seen you in action. And so it can be really useful to get that information. And it helps promote your self-esteem because you get to understand what your strengths are, you get to feel good about that, but you can also practically speak to the value when you're in the stage of writing up a resume in an interview room, and again, tie those into the biases. Well, here's ways that I actually excel, can contribute to the organization. The next one is be prepared. This is so much of what we've talked about. It's what can you do? What do you have influence over? Understanding your strengths, being able to address the biases, doing the market research, which, Cheryl has touched on throughout this webinar. This lets us feel prepared, and that allows us to also take action. So, Cheryl touched on this as well. If you're new to an industry, you're facing certain kinds of biases, we have to make sure we're up to date with things, and we have tangible ways to demonstrate this through your language, through specific trainings. Having that and showing you're a continuous learner is critical for switching industries, but it's also going to make us feel so confident, right? We're going to be able to answer those questions, and we're going to know I have done everything I can do to position myself in the best way possible. I'm not saying that guarantees you're going to get a job. Again, I'm not here to tell you you haven't done these things, but I want to validate and reaffirm that that's all we can ask of ourselves, right? Have I done as much as I can do to put myself in the best position possible, right? It's a really empowering thing to feel prepared. And lastly, define yourself in new ways. I know we're here to talk about career and talk about how to, make these changes happen and more seamless. But careers, while a large part, they don't have to be the entirety of our lives and our identity. So this can be an opportunity for us to recognize, connect, and develop different sides of ourselves. It feels good to know that I enjoy lots of things. I'm good at lots of different things. I contribute in different ways. So really, I want you to stay connected to hobbies, learn new skills, rediscover what you're interested in, how you like to spend your time. We all contain multitudes. So I really encourage that sort of mindset. Finally, last set of strategies here are using balanced thinking. And this is about changing the way we think about our experience and in turn shift not only our perspectives, but potentially the perspectives of employers or future employers. So the first one is a next career phase. Fact is, we are living longer, we're living healthier lives, and so that means we're working longer. And we want to think about this transition as the next phase of your career with lots of time to give to an organization, an exciting time in your life versus a forced change or like your biding time. Now, again, this may or may not be true for you, but if we're thinking, I'm just here until I can move on, not entirely motivating, right? So if we believe that this is an exciting new chapter, we're going to be much more willing to invest in the change. We're going to come across as authentic and genuine in our interviews. And we're going to be really resilient in the process because, again, it's about what I can do, what is coming next, right? And I also like to remind people that just as you experience other times or phases in your career, it takes time to find the right role and to make these changes happen. So remember that this is a process, and things not happening overnight isn't like, that's not always indicative of a failing on your part, okay? The next one is recognize, not internalize. And this ties in with some of the self-esteem strategies I was talking about, in that we want to be able to experience our emotions without judging our core worth, right? And this helps us avoid internalizing the thoughts we have when we're feeling low, but also leaves, I think, room for honest conversations with ourselves and allows us to recognize opportunities for growth potentially. So as an example, if you're experiencing bias regarding age, you might be thinking, I no longer have value in the workplace. And that is internalized as I have no value. That kind of statement does not feel good. It is not something that is going to be helpful in any way. So we want to remind, yourself, as we've discussed throughout this, like what experience you bring, the knowledge, the insight, the maturity, that's something absolutely that needs to be acknowledged, right? But also we can say, okay, what are some of my growth edges? Is there any truth to the feedback I am hearing? And I will say, sort of as a final note on that, a job loss or a transition and even employer bias, like they are a reflection of many things. So like job markets changing, the economy shifting, shifting interests, gaps in knowledge, all sorts of elements, but they're not necessarily reflective of you as a person or employee, okay? And then finally, challenge your thoughts. And this is actively challenging sort of the negative thought cycles we can get in. And that's a really key part of resiliency. When we're constantly, thinking negative things or feeling quite hopeless, our entire outlook of our situation becomes negative and also very mentally, emotionally draining. Another piece is that it's not always entirely representative of our circumstances. Again, we can separate, that we can have feelings or emotions about our experiences, but sometimes the truth of the matter differs. I also want to say that this isn't about being positive all the time. That's not realistic. It's not helpful. It's about balanced views, okay? So if we move on to the next slide, I have a little chart here that kind of outlines what the approach is with this. So first, we want to identify the thought that we're continually having. Then we want to see if we can find facts and not feelings that support it. And I think that that's a really key piece. When you're like, I'm feeling rejected, therefore it's true. No, that's an emotion you're experiencing, right? A fact would be something grounded in some truth. So for example, no one will hire someone from the oil and gas sector. Evidence is that maybe we know crossing industries has been tough. We've heard that feedback. We've been told it. Maybe we haven't gotten as many interviews as we would like. But we also know that people have done it, right? This isn't quite as black and white as maybe that rejection feels. So the thought or an alternative balanced thought can be, it can be a challenge, but there are opportunities for me. I just haven't found them yet. Or I haven't received any job offers and I'm feeling rejected, but I can and will keep going. This again is about keeping ourselves motivated, recognizing the truth of the matter, while also acknowledging that it's a tough time, okay? So a final set of tools here are some resources on the next slide. And these are just different websites that I think are really useful. They're ones I use with my clients. Some of them have free resources. Some of them are more individualized support, but I definitely encourage you to check them out. Incredibly useful. And finally, I just want to provide our email and website and phone number. So if you have any further questions, need further support, please visit us at calgarycareercounseling.com, call us, reach out in any way. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for listening, and remember that the actions you take and the ways you take care of yourself during this time are really important. You have the skills and experiences. They're all valuable. Look after yourself, and remember, it is not if you find a job, it is when. So I will turn it back over. Thank you, everybody, for your time.
Thanks very much. And now I'm going to turn it over to Pat, who's been monitoring the chat. She's going to go through some of the questions you've asked and presumably answer some of the questions. And if she can't answer them, then she'll pose them to either Avery or myself. Pat.
Great. Thank you to both Cheryl and Avery for, for some great information. And just in monitoring the chat, I would say one of the questions that came up was just around some of those resources to help assess transferability. And I think the question came in as Cheryl was going through her presentation. So hopefully the slides that followed helped to identify, different resources that could help someone assess their transferability. I think I really would like to draw people's attention to the Careers in Energy and careertransitions.ca websites, because we do a much deeper dive, especially on the careertransitions.ca website, on the transferability between oil and gas and the other sectors around those other two components of transferability beyond technical. So the nature of work and the value proposition, and some key considerations there to help you assess transferability of fit or what you're looking for. And so again, those are some of the key resources. We do have webinars coming up as well that will do a deeper dive on particular industries and transferability. So you can certainly stay tuned for those. But I'd also say that we have on our YouTube channel postings and previously recorded webinars that do a deeper dive on the adjacent sectors that we've assessed for transferability. So all of those resources are available to you. And then just use those as a bit of a launch pad in terms of, other kinds of information that might be out there to support that transferability assessment. And I'll just make a note that we can share a link to those other recorded webinars for your resource as well. The other sort of a lot of chat was around LinkedIn profiles. And while, you have a bit more control in your resume in terms of not providing, information that, discloses your age, really allows you to kind of hone in on the relevant experience based on the job posting or the job that you're applying for. Maybe not the same kind of flexibility on a LinkedIn profile that is, there to be more general. You're not sort of customizing your LinkedIn profile over and over again. And so just questions are, around hints to kind of align your LinkedIn profile, because recruiters are likely to go there with what you're saying in your resume. And I guess a couple of things that come to mind, and also acknowledging on LinkedIn, you almost, because of the format of it, you almost have to fill in those work history fields and that kind of stuff. So, a couple of things that come to mind for me is same as with a resume, and, what's the first thing, recruiter or somebody within a company is going to see? It's going to be that headline, and it's that about section. So again, use those opportunities to really kind of hook a recruiter into, what it is you do, what you're passionate about, and what value you provide an employer. And then, I mean, you have to list sort of the, your jobs and your work history and that kind of stuff, but use what you have available to you to really kind of hook you in on that. Hook the recruiter or employer in. I don't know, Cheryl, do you have any other suggestions in terms of what to do with that LinkedIn profile?
Well, when I caught up with the chat, when Avery was presenting, I went and looked at my LinkedIn profile to double check what it conveyed about me. And there's a couple of things. You do have to put in the years of employment with, for me, consulting or jobs. I probably went further back than I would like to looking at it today, but I can go in and edit that. But when I looked at my education, I didn't see any requirement to put years of graduation. So unless I'm missing something, I still, with selecting the employment opportunities I highlight, I still have control over that and promoting my education without saying when I took it. So I think Pat used the word align. The important thing is that your resume and your LinkedIn profile needs to be aligned because people will be looking at both.
Great. One of the other questions, and I'll pose this to Avery, came up, around that whole fight, flight, or freeze, and maybe, I mean, I think there was some clarification in the chat around, those are kind of feelings, or, they're not recommended approaches.
Yes.
How do you recognize if you're in them? And then how do you get yourself out of them if that's what you find where you're at?
Well, I think that's sort of what we talked about, right? Is recognizing those things come from assessing what are the feelings that I'm experiencing, right? What are the emotions? And then we can also take a look at our behaviors as well, right? So like, as I said, I gave some of those examples of fight can be, maybe really spending all of your time with a job search. That's what you do at the sacrifice of other things in your life that you enjoy. Some emotions that might be associated with that are like, I'm feeling really preoccupied. I'm feeling really irritable and frustrated about this. So again, we want to recognize both emotions as well as behaviors on that. And then in terms of getting out of that, that's why we ask the question, right? Because we want to be able to say, okay, so if I'm in freeze and I'm feeling hopeless and I'm not actually doing anything, well, what can that tell us? Maybe I need to take some action. And it doesn't have to be huge action. That doesn't mean you need to the next day apply for a bunch of jobs. It means, okay, maybe I just need to start looking at different job postings. What are some small steps I can take that adjust that, right? Doing something different than what I am doing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks. And I do want to get to one more question that, again, was in the chat that we've heard before, is that frustration for job seekers, especially an experienced job seeker that sees a job posting and what they're asking for, or even how they maybe title the job posting, like junior such and such. Yet when you look at what they expect of that role, it is obvious that it's going to need more experience than perhaps what they've labeled that particular job posting for. And how do you, how do you deal with that, and that frustration? And so I'm going to share some of my thoughts. Then again, I'll let Cheryl add anything here. But I think when you see that, I think it's about a couple of questions to ask yourself. one is there anything you can do in your resume to really kind of challenge or influence how the company is looking at that role? And if just on paper in your resume, you're not going to have an opportunity to influence or change the company's mind, I think you have to take a step back and really say, is this worth my time and energy to apply for a role? Because you may have been in previous webinars where Avery has talked about locus of control. And it really is within your locus of control not to put yourself into that situation where you're not setting yourself up for success because of how that job has been listed or posted. And I think the other thing is, if you see that disconnect, but you're still very keen about the role, find out if you can learn more about the job posting. Is there somebody within the company that that you can maybe talk to about what the role is or what's going on in the company, why they might be trying to fill that role and understand the role a little bit better? Or even doing more research into the company on their website, or recent news releases about projects or work that they're doing. Try to understand maybe why they positioned the role as such, and because of the focus or the priority of the company. And then again, decide based on what can you influence or position yourself as a potential successful applicant by applying for it? Cheryl, do you have anything else to add there?
Yes, I will, but I'm going to go to our Stay Connected page because we've reached sort of our targeted end time. So for anybody that has to leave, I just want to draw your attention to this. But so yeah, I agree on controlling what you can and letting go what you can't. One of the questions in the post are, those employers that offer a salary that's clearly below market. Well, you're not going to negotiate your way through a 20% uplift from that posted salary. So don't even go there. Don't increase your frustration level, move on to something else, because there are employers, especially as the market is changing, that understand they need to be competitive in order for you to stick or stay with them. The second thing, and I'll just segue into another question that was asked in the chat that Pat might not have seen. And the question was, do I really truncate the experience in my resume? And the answer is yes. You really do. If you feel ageism is a factor, and if you want to avoid telegraphing how old you are, and if there was an early experience that you feel you need to highlight, you can do that in different ways, in your About You paragraph or the value that you offer. But I mean, here, I'll telegraph my age. I started working in 1980 professionally after my first degree. Nobody cares what I did in that first 10 or 15 years, and it's not really relevant. So I leave it off. So yes, do use some judgment around that. And you may in fact have different resumes for different employers, but as you've pointed out, watch that LinkedIn profile is sort of aligns with what would be your best way of positioning yourself. Pat, I'll just turn it over to you to close and thank everybody.
Fabulous. Yes, thank you very much for attending today. You'll receive this information when we circulate the follow-up email, so I'm not going to go in it in detail, other than to say there are ways to stay connected with us and up to date. By following us on LinkedIn, not only do we share upcoming workshops, we also try to share job postings that we come across. And we also, try to share more recent articles or information related to the transitioning workforce and where the oil and gas industry is headed from an evolving ecosystem perspective. Upcoming workshops, they'll be advertised in our newsletter. You will be receiving our newsletter simply as participating in this webinar. And so it's another way to kind of stay connected with what we're doing and up to date. Again, appreciate your time. We wish you all the best. And if you found value in this, we certainly have other things coming up in terms of information sharing opportunities, looking at, learning opportunities for those that are looking to make a transition. And we also have some employer forums in the works. So stay connected and participate in some of our upcoming events.